doch noch relativ zahlreich heute Morgen schon um 10 Uhr den Weg hierhin gefunden haben. Ich freue mich sehr, dass wir diesen Tag gestern hatten und heute noch einen dazu. Und ja, möchte Ihnen einmal kurz vorstellen, wie der Ablauf des heutigen Tages sein wird. Wir haben heute Morgen nochmal 2 Blöcke mit jeweils Keynotes an dieser Stelle und Workshops oben im Raum. Und dann heute Nachmittag die Session von 14 Uhr bis ungefähr 16 Uhr vermutlich, wo es dann darum geht, dass sich die Workshops hier einmal vorstellen können und Ergebnisse zeigen können, was einfach total spannend war. Vielleicht haben Sie das gestern Abend mitbekommen, der Workshop, der zuletzt lief oben, hat freiwillig überzogen. Die sind dann irgendwann so kurz nach 7 oder so, kamen die dann wieder runter, weil sie irgendwie noch weiter arbeiten wollten an ihren Scribbles und an ihren Ideen. Also ich glaube, das wird ganz spannend. Heute Nachmittag um 14 Uhr geht das hier los. Zwischendurch gibt es natürlich ein Mittagessen und falls Sie sich gerade freuen oder fragen, warum hier an der Uni so viel los ist am Samstag, wir haben heute Tag der offenen Tür. Das heißt, da läuft auch gerade zum Beispiel irgendwie das allergrößte Frühstück Dortmunds, Deutschlands, der Welt, also auf jeden Fall ein großes Frühstück in der Mensa. Also wer noch mehr Hunger hat und neben diesem Kuchen oder mit diesem Kuchen noch nicht zufrieden ist, der draußen schon steht, findet da auch noch mehr zu essen. So. Ich kann Ihnen schon mal ankündigen, wir haben in diesem Panel hier leider heute Morgen einen Ausfall. Marco Maas kann nicht bei uns sein, aber Marco Maas hat glücklicherweise das Thema seines Vortrags gerade erst bei TEDx Hamburg vorgestellt auch. Und das Video werden wir dann gleich einfach zeigen. Es ist eine Viertelstunde, geht es genau um das, was auch in seinem Vortrag angekündigt ist im Programm. Sie werden dann leider nicht die Möglichkeit haben, Fragen zu stellen. Sein Twitter-Account heißt The Maastrix und wenn Sie gute Besserung twittern wollen, tun Sie sich bitte keinen Zwang an, da freut er sich bestimmt. Ja, so. Aber jetzt zum ersten Vortrag des heutigen Tages. Sie sehen schon, der Titel ist angeschlagen. Ich grüße sehr, sehr herzlich Neil Thurman bei uns, der von der Ludwigs-Maximilians-Universität in München zu uns kommt und dort am Institut für Kommunikationswissenschaften forscht. Und der ein Werkzeug entwickelt hat, Social Sensor heißt es, da geht es einfach darum, wie findet man, wie Sie hier auch lesen können, News, Anstöße, Menschen, die Einfluss haben in sozialen Netzwerken, wie lässt sich das mit Hilfe von Algorithmen automatisiert herausfinden. Wir haben für den Talk jetzt ein bisschen mehr Zeit, dadurch, dass Marco Maas Talk eine Minute ist. Insofern ja, freue ich mich sehr, dass es losgehen kann. We're happy to have you here. Welcome here.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. So I want to talk about the experiences that we've had in building and testing a tool for journalists that tries to detect news and trends from social media, and also helps in the verification process. And I don't think I need to tell a bunch of journalists how important social media has become as a news source. So I wouldn't dream of showing some old cliched examples of news that's broken first on social media, like the Hudson River plane crash or the Boston Marathon bombers being captured. But actually, these examples aren't very representative, although we see them cited a lot, because most of the time social media is used more as a tip-off mechanism rather than being quoted directly. But that of course doesn't reduce its value. So what are the problems with using social media as a source? You're probably very familiar with many of the problems. So volume, just a number of, for example, tweets. Half a billion a day sent out. Also, how little of the stuff is newsworthy. This is something that we're all aware of. And another problem, of course, is sifting the fake stuff from the real stuff. So these are some of the issues that we have to face when we're using social media as a source as journalists, but also when we're building tools that are trying to help sift and verify information from social media. And if we ask journalists whether they need such tools, then if they say yes, and even those who are pretty experienced in social media. So these are kind of familiar problems, how to exploit a vast amount of content, and journalists saying yes, we need tools, we need computational tools, we need algorithms. The ones we have aren't good enough. And you're probably aware of some of the tools that are already out there. Spike is one that some of you may be familiar with. And a lot of these tools have functionality that is sort of converging, and so if you've observed them over the last couple of years, you've seen new things coming out that weren't in one tool, but now are. So Spike, for example, is great for detecting trends, as those who've used it will testify, but it doesn't really help in verification. And things like SAM and Geophedia are very useful in verification, because you can focus in on a very narrow geographical area. You can see the individual social media posts that are emanating from that area in real time. So if you know the location of an event, then they can be useful, not just in verification, but also in finding follow-up information and first-hand quotes and that sort of thing. But they don't do event detection. And so when we were building the social sensor tool, we were trying rather ambitiously to cover everything that journalists might need from a tool that detects trends and events in social media, and also helped in verification. And it's available as an iOS app. You can download it onto your iPhone or your iPad. It's still in beta, so it's not as it's not been as fully commercialised as things like Geophedia or Spike, and that's because of the nature of its development. So it was a collaboration between academics and journalists and technology companies, funded by the European Union, and the money ran out, and it is where it is, and there's no more money to sort of develop it further, unfortunately. And this was, in part because of various disputes between the parties who were involved, and patent claims being made, and so forth. So although a lot was achieved, it wasn't a perfect model to get a tool out there that could compete sort of in the commercial world. So what did we try and do? Well, we tried to design and build a single tool that all in one platform could surface stories in real time, could help in the verification process, could extract not just themes and topics and events, but also multimedia material, because we know how important that is to journalists. We also wanted to extract the context around the stories. So sentiment, what's the sentiment around the story? Is it positive? Is it negative? We wanted to be able to focus in on narrow time frames, on specific locations, and we wanted to try and search across a range of social media platforms. So it wasn't an unambitious set of tasks, and we didn't manage to achieve all of them fully, but we learned some, I think, very useful lessons in the process about what you can extract from social media. And I think one of the important things is it's not just about detecting events, it's not just about detecting new stories, because actually if you look at the scientific evidence, stories are often not mentioned first on social media. So although we've got in our minds examples of stories like the Hudson River plane crash and the capture of the Boston Marathon bombing suspects, that we kind of think, okay, everything is breaking first on social media. In fact, if you look at the evidence, you'll find that mainstream news media is first in terms of mentioning stories more often than social media networks. So this was some research published last year by Miles Osborne and a colleague, and they were looking at a range of sort of representative stories and looking at the first mention of those stories. And you can see that the overwhelming majority of the stories were mentioned first on mainstream media channels. Twitter came first or first equal, in more cases than Facebook. And the other lesson we can learn from this is, if you're looking to find a breaking news story, don't use Google+. But that probably doesn't come as a surprise to most of you. And so it's not just about detecting news first; it's also about the other things that are important to journalists. So, as I've said, finding out about trends. Okay, so there's a lot of stories there's a lot of potential stories out there, but how are you going to find out which ones your audience might be interested in? So trends is a key thing. How do the audience feel about a story? Again, that's something you can try to find in social media. And of course, once a story has broken, you can then use social media to get ongoing, developments and contacts and content. And then, of course, verification and finding out the reliability of not just the content, but the contributor who's contributed that particular content. So that's the kind of range of things that we wanted to do. And just coming back to Spike, because I don't know if anybody uses Spike, and if you do, you may have seen just over the last couple of months they've introduced a new Instagram posts tab and a Facebook posts tab. So this is really just to say that Twitter might be fastest, but Twitter isn't a particularly rich source in terms of multimedia, and also it has a particular demographic. So it's interesting to see that some of the tools that are out there are focusing on Instagram and Facebook as sources of native content from social media. Okay, so one of the first questions that we had to answer was, how much of the content on the social media networks do we listen to? So we were using the Twitter search API. We didn't have hundreds of thousands of euros a month spare to buy into the full Twitter Firehose feed. So we were limited in the number of searches we could make, but it turns out actually that you don't need to monitor everything that's going on. And so what we decided to do was focus on a limited number of what we called news hounds. So these were people that were expert on particular subjects, and people who were on Twitter and were on Facebook, other social media networks, and were sharing the information that they had with other people. And so they could be journalists, bloggers, activists. They could be, PR people, whoever. So we hoped if we could find these news hounds, follow them, monitor what they say, then we could gather information in a sort of rapid and flexible way, and that the information would be relatively trustworthy. So how did we come to our database of news hounds? Well, what we decided to do was start with a list of journalists and then see who they followed. So we did various experiments. We started with a list of BBC journalists. We started with another list of New York Times journalists. We also had a list of a mixed list of journalists from various organisations, and then we looked at who their sources were on Twitter. So who are they following? Who are their sources? So this was, for example, Liz Doucette, who's the BBC's chief international correspondent. So as you can see, she's got 2,000. She follows 2,000 people on Twitter. So she was on our seed list. We added all the people that she followed to our database, and so on. Then quite quickly we ended up with a database with hundreds of thousands of different sources. So then it's a question of trying to cut those down, because actually you don't need to follow hundreds of thousands of people to catch most of the news from, in this case, Twitter, but social media in general. So how did we cut that number down, that number of potential news hounds down to a final database of just a few thousand? Well, we used a scoring mechanism, and so we gave points, for example, to people who were verified on Twitter. If they were on a Twitter list, they got points. Their activity, the number of people that followed them, and so forth. And then we also blacklisted some people who scored highly. So, so Justin Bieber, for example, under this scoring system, scores very highly, as you can imagine, with 50, or was it 5? I can't quite beat, but it's several million followers. So we had a blacklist of certain people that we excluded. Now, what was interesting was that we tried seeding the list with different sets of journalists. So we tried the BBC list and the New York Times list, and then a mixed list. And what we found in the end was, once we applied a scoring system to the people in the database sourced from the various lists, we ended up with a final database that was very similar, just independent of who we started with. And what we also found was that by following just a few thousand people, we could capture up to 90% of the news that occurred during a particular time period. Now our definition of news was what had been published in the mainstream media. Now that's not everyone's definition of news, but this was a tool that was designed for journalists, and so, as I said, we could capture up to 90% of news in a given period with a relatively small number of people being monitored by the tool, so just a few thousand. And the reason for this is that actually the dispersion of news on social media is skewed in this way to a log normal distribution. So it's actually relatively few well-informed and well-followed individuals who play a key role in the dissemination of news. So there's more to finding news and trends than just following the right people, and there's a number of techniques that we used in the social sensor tool. I'll mention a couple because I think they're of interest here. But one of the things that we did was prioritise social media posts that contained proper nouns, so places, people, organisations. And another thing we did was to penalise topics that had an ongoing popularity. So in other words, if events were bursty, they were seen as more important by the software, more likely to be detected as an event. So, this was just this is just an example from one of the sort of early experiments that we did, just tracking the Twitter activity over a few hours during the last night of the US presidential election. And you can see, sort of fairly steady rate of tweeting up until the moment that Barack Obama sent out his victory tweet, and then you can see a huge spike. So it's these sorts of bursts that the software uses in part to cluster social media posts into distinct events. Now, one question you might be asking is, well, who are these, or who were these news, or who are these news hounds? Who are the people that you were following? Now, we did an analysis of who they are, and you can see that they're predominantly male, with an equal number of female and institutional accounts. And so, with all these decisions that you make about how the automation will work, there are consequences, and one of the consequences is how representative are the sources that you're listening to. So there's a bias towards men, and then when we look at who the news hounds are in terms of their affiliation, you can see that an overwhelming majority work for mainstream media channels, and then we also have government accounts, politicians and so forth, but much smaller proportion of those. So these, you might call these biases, and these biases occur despite a quote neutral scoring system. And so this sort of raises questions about how these kind of tools should operate. So should they be tuned to listen, as they were in this case, to those who are being talked about the most, to those who do the most talking, and those with the largest audience, or should they be agents for change, if you like, and tuned in to pick up the stories and experiences of those underrepresented in the media. And I'll come back to that question at the end. And then another issue regarding the way the software detects events that are relatively sort of short term in their popularity, so events that are bursty, is, well, firstly, whether, if more and more journalists use such tools, whether that reinforces a kind of short-termism in terms of what's being covered. But then another question is whether such tools can be manipulated by people who want to get their messages across. So you may be aware of Thunderclap, and Thunderclap is a tool that you can use to, as you can see, amplify your message on social media with the power of the crowd. And so the idea with Thunderclap is that you send a post out, and then you have a series of, you try and get a series of followers to agree to repost that tweet, for example. And if you reach your threshold, then all of the people who support your campaign will retweet that tweet at exactly the same time. So you can see how that would be picked up, for example, by tools like social censor, because it would create, a very distinct burst in activity that actually would be more effective in terms of getting your message across and getting your message picked up by tools like social censor than if your followers retweeted your message over a longer period of time. So that's something about how we were detecting events and detecting trends. One of the other important parts of the project was verification. So it's all very well if software alerts journalists to clusters of trending topics and breaking news stories. But if you don't have any context, then those clusters can be a trap, because they could contain a mixture of truth and lies. And as I'm sure you're aware, social media networks carry significant amounts of misinformation. And actually, the research evidence shows that, especially around, a breaking news story, you get a significant amount of misinformation. People set up, social media accounts after events, immediately after events like Hurricane Sandy or even the Boston Marathon bombings, and they start posting out misinformation. And some of it's, funny. And there were a lot of things like this around Hurricane Sandy, where people, tweeted pictures of, sharks swimming around in their backyards. But of course, there are also examples where, the mainstream media picked up something from social media and republished it. And it's had quite serious consequences. So you may have seen this example. It was a photograph the BBC found on social media. They published. They said it was a photograph of a massacre in Syria, but then it became clear it was actually a photograph taken in Iraq 9 years earlier. So they had to swiftly take that down. So when we were thinking about how to build in tools for verification into the software, we kind of broke it down into the content, the contributor, and then the context around the message. And this is sort of a fairly familiar framework for people who are verifying social media content in more manual ways. So in terms of content, as you know, there's various things you can do to analyse the content of a message. Maybe try and detect some evidence of photoshopping. This is a North Korean government photograph with not very good photoshopping in evidence. With contributors, there's a lot of information that's of use about their network and their history. and this is another sort of well-known example you may be familiar with, a Twitter account that was purporting to be the Prime Minister of Libya, and it got followed by several important people, including the British Foreign Minister. It was quoted in the media, and then someone had a look and said, well, wait a minute, would the Libyan Prime Minister say that he was going to make all Libyans tree-hugging hippies? And it turned out that it wasn't a genuine account, and rather than being verified by Twitter, someone had just got the blue tick and put it on the background that they were using. So quite a simple trick, but an effective trick in this case. And then context. So what are other people saying, around the social media post that you're trying to verify? And there's been research in this area as well. So, for example, at the time of the Chilean earthquake in 2010, there were quite a few fake tsunami warnings being issued on Twitter. But there were also a lot of denials as well, and the research showed that for every one fake tsunami warning, there were about 10 denials. And so this is the sort of information that, again, can be useful, the contextual information around what you're trying to verify. So, I mean, we did various experiments, and we ended up building in some verification tools into Social Sensor. It was relatively hard to make the verification of individual pieces of content work. So one of the things we did was we tried to get the software to be able to spot fake from real photos that came up as a result of the Boston Marathon bombings and Hurricane Sandy. So we had a corpus of fake pictures, like the shark swimming around in the backyard, and then we had a corpus of real images, and we got the software to try and learn the fake ones from the real ones. And it did a fairly good job in controlled conditions. So if you trained it on the Hurricane Sandy corpus, and then you showed it an image it didn't know from Hurricane Sandy, it managed to get, it managed to guess whether it was fake or real in about 75% of cases. But then when we, if we trained it on Hurricane Sandy and then we showed it an image from another event, then it didn't do very well at all. In fact, it was essentially just guessing. It was sort of 50-50. So we didn't, in the end, integrate anything to verify an individual piece of content, like a picture, into the tool. Although with better training, the success rate would improve. But there's considerable challenges in automatically giving credibility scores to individual pieces of content on social media. So what we did do in the end was give credibility scores to individual contributors, because with contributors you've got a lot more information to work with. You can look at their history, you can look at their network, and this is just how it looks in the web version of Social Sensor. But how do we do that? Well, we went through a sort of iterative process, and we used journalists to help us in this. So we looked at the history of the contributor, their popularity, their influence. And in the first round, we kind of weighted all of these factors equally. And then when it came to testing, we had to do something a bit different from what we did with the fake and the real pictures. So what we decided to do was get a bunch of real journalists and ask them to assess the credibility of the set of contributors, and then we got the software to do the same. And then we compared the results, and actually even in the first round, the journalist evaluations were pretty close to the software's evaluations, but there was room for improvements. So there was a bit more in terms of the deviation within the set of scores. So what we did in the second round was, well, we had a look at what the journalist was saying, and actually, for contributors who were inactive on Twitter, the software was sort of scoring them down more than the journalists necessarily would do. So here you have somebody who's a well-known journalist for the BBC, BBC security correspondent, and someone who's not very active, only posted about 500 tweets since 2011. So he was getting marked down by the software, but the journalists were looking at his profile, and they were looking at who was, in particular, they were looking at who was following him. And so then we kind of iterated the scoring system. We gave more weight to the number of followers, and we also added some new metrics. So, if someone was verified by Twitter, if they'd managed to gain a lot of followers in a short period of time, that's a popularity metric. So we use these metrics, and then we got a better set of scores, although still not perfect. And this is just one example. So we've got the deputy leader of the British Labour Party. She's only getting 5 out of 10 from the software in terms of credibility at the moment. So the software is a little bit reluctant to sort of give 8s and 9s and 10s out of 10s, unlike our human journalists. But we do think it's a fairly useful system even in its current state. So reflecting on the project as a whole, the particular tool that we built relies on the input of journalists to power many of its processes, and we used the ground truth of journalistic output to measure its success to some degree. And so it's a tool that's kind of been created in our own image, in the image of the journalists whose inputs are driving it. And if we kind of come back to those kind of quotes biases, particularly in terms of who the sources are, it does listen to people who are vocal and have an audience, but many of them are men in the media, and it also prioritises, as I've said, stories that have short-term interest. So is there an alternative to those decisions that we made? Well, I mean, yes, of course, we could change the inputs, we could change some of the decisions that we made, but they might not. If we did so, they might not result in a better product. So if we reduce if we widen the time window through which stories have to pass to be identified, then the risk is we're not going to be able to identify breaking news events as well. And we could get the system to operate with a different set of news hounds, so we could monitor a different set of people. But how are we going to choose them, and who's going to choose them? But there is merit to the transparency and the accountability of the selection mechanism that we use, which is based on popularity and productivity and the ability to engage. And I mean, it also works well because, as I said, there appears to be a normal distribution of people who disseminate news. So, I mean, in terms of the biases, I think that the project shows how social media amplifies and concentrates existing trends in news as much as it enlarges the discourse. And the increasing use of social media in news as a source, with tools like social censor or not, isn't any guarantee of correction to the gender inequalities and the insularity of the media. Rather, I think we need to focus on changes to the demography of journalism and to its practices if we want to affect those sorts of changes. So that's the end of the presentation. I'll be happy to take questions.
So sorry, maybe I didn't get this, but do you only take Twitter as a source, or was it just an example?
Well, it's Twitter and Facebook at the moment. The ambition was to include, a full range of social media networks, but the project in its current state is just taking input from Facebook and Twitter.
Thank you for the talk. A very basic question. What was the definition of news? How would you actually say that this given tweet is, or message is news or not? And
it was what had been published, in the mainstream media. So what we did was we looked at Spike, which has a database of about 100,000 news sources. So published news sources, and then we took the top stories from Spike, so the stories that were trending, and that became our sort of ground truth, our baseline of news, and then we used then the software. The software then in the same time period, produced its list of news stories. So it was a comparison against what had been published over a particular time period by a wide range of news sources and what was sort of trending.
Right. So basically, you was trying to find that kind of matches, but which happened in social media before they've been published.
No.
Because if it's just retweet of mainstream media, well, it's something different. It's just retweet. It's not like the news coming from social media.
Yeah, I mean, the tool, and it had a number of, as I said, a number of aims. I mean, if it could find something on social media that hadn't been broken first, by mainstream media, then great. But actually, if you look at how these things happen, and that's why I showed the slide early on. Most news breaks first on mainstream media. So it wasn't only about identifying new stories. It was also about identifying trends and finding multimedia content, finding updates, and also helping in the verification process.
So basically, the definition of news really stems from mainstream media. Because there is another point of view, like we can really find something from social media, right?
Yeah, I mean, mainstream media, yes, but I mean, we used a database of a very wide range of sources. So, we were potentially looking at 100,000 news sources, and then finding them, the stories that were most popular, and then using that as the ground truth. But yeah, I mean, this is a sort of criticism that not just the definition of news, but also the sources are predominantly journalists, and also in the verification process we use journalists to calibrate the system. So we were basing a lot of the decisions that we made and the inputs the tool was using on the knowledge or the output of journalists or people in the media. So that's criticism, but the tool, I mean, the tool had a number of, you know, I mean, it had a whole range of partners, including, you know, Deutsche Welle. It was designed from the beginning to be a tool that journalists would want to use. So it wasn't trying to sort of redefine what news is. It was trying to sort of, you know, produce results that would be of use to journalists and that would, you know, match, you know, the way that they went about, you know, sourcing and verification. And I, you know, perfectly accept that, you know, that can be criticised, but that was the particular sort of framework that the project operated in.
I have one proposal and one question. The proposal first, maybe you could specialize on topics like sports or politics also and get the scores higher if the group of input people is smaller and more concentrated. Or one could localize the whole thing to get local news.
Yeah, I can answer that straight away. So what we've actually got in the tool, we've got three sets of news hounds. So we have a UK set, we have a US set, and then we have a celebrity set because you know, we had a wide range of partners, and one of the partners, Yahoo, you know, they were interested in celebrity news. So you can focus geographically on, you know, US or UK news hounds, and also topically you can focus on celebrity news hounds and celebrity news. So that could be extended. So you could have different sets of news hounds that were focused on, you know, even narrower geographical areas, or, you know, a wider range of topics, not just celebrity news, but, you know, finance and so forth. So that, you know, that sort of differentiation by geography, by topic, was built in at a sort of small scale at the beginning, and it could, you know, it could in theory be expanded. Yes, so.
And the question is, you made your tool for journalists, but when I consider it from the point of view of the customer at the end, what do I need a journalist for?
What do you need a journalist for?
Yeah. I just use your tool and I get informed.
Well, there was actually a version of it. There's also a version of the tool that was designed for the public. So again, you know, we had because we had this very wide range of partners. One of the partners was interested in sort of cutting the journalists, you know, out and using the tool to produce, you know, output that could be, you know, consumed directly by the public. But you know, we still need journalists, not just to make, you know, the tool work, but you know, particularly in verification. I mean, we didn't get really anywhere in verification, and despite putting quite a lot of work into it, not in terms of, you know, verifying individual pieces of content. We got some way along the path towards being able to sort of give a credibility score to contributors, but that's only a sort of a guidance. You know, it's a warning. It doesn't sort of mean that journalists can, you know, hand over responsibility to the software just because it's saying, you know, somebody's 10 out of 10, but everything that you hear from them can be trusted. So it was very much, you know, something that we were hoping would be used in a sort of holistic way to provide, you know, help in a verification, guidance in a verification process, and also, you know, in terms of trending and, you know, event detection, provide, you know, a better sort of tip-off mechanism than social media can at the moment. So we don't see this as being the end point. We see it as being sort of the beginning point. And journalists doing what they're doing now and using you know, what social sensor provides as a sort of tip-off, and then going to the, you know, location themselves, or, you know, following up themselves, and then, you know, writing the story.
Well, every selection process can be criticized, but I found the way how you selected these news hounds pretty balanced. I was just wondering, why do you select people who would send out at least 10 tweets per day? This doesn't really make sense to me. So this was one question. The other question was, could you elaborate a little bit on how you would evaluate content from Facebook, or how you would evaluate pages or accounts from Facebook? Because there you have a completely different metrics, or apparently the metrics used for Twitter wouldn't work there, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm probably not the best person to answer those questions because, you know, as you can imagine, with a sort of quite a large international multidisciplinary team, you know, various parts of the project were sort of parceled off to different groups. I mean, with the metrics for, you know, who to include, you know, we did various experiments, and actually we're presenting next week in Dubrovnik. There's a conference on, you know, robo-journalism. You're going there as well. Okay, well, you'll find out more. So yeah, I mean, we did various experiments, you know, to see which metrics work best, and, you know, it ended up that, you know, that level of activity was determined to be sort of necessary or an important metric. In terms of Facebook, I don't have the answer offhand because, you know, again, that was a different team who were integrating the Facebook module. But yeah, I mean, it's a different set of metrics. I mean, obviously, you've got, you know, a certain amount of commonality in terms of followers, in terms of interactions, you know, shares and likes and so forth. So there's a certain amount of similarity, but, you know, some differences as well.
Thanks a lot for the talk. You had this interesting question, how to parameterize the output of the system if it is to be tuned to mainstream news or change of agent of change. This is what you called it, so changes in reporting and low recall facts, so to speak. Could you elaborate on your thoughts regarding this issue a little bit more, please?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that, you know, comes up in discussions, you know, because we see the composition of the news hounds, and, you know, they're very, you know, gender biased. They're also, you know, insular in both in terms of, you know, the media listening to itself. But also in terms of geography, because I didn't show, you know, that particular slide, but we, you know, for example, the UK-focused database of journalists, you know, includes, you know, international correspondence and so forth, but it's, you know, the composition of that database is very sort of is very developed and Western and UK-focused, and, you know, similar for the US. So, you know, there is gender bias, there is sort of a level of insularity, but it's difficult to you know, to think how you would, you know, how you could come up with something that, you know, achieved, you know, that sort of degree of change without sort of compromising the performance of the system. And I mean, because we were, you know, focused on producing a system that that sort of mimicked, you know, what journalists expected, then, you know, it was to an extent tuned, you know, with that in mind. But it would be interesting to, and a lot of the, you know, the data and the source materials are available in the public domain because it was funded by the European Union. So it'd be interesting for someone else to sort of pick it up and try and, you know, do some work to, you know, tune the system to listen to a different set of sources and see what the results were, and then, you know, ask journalists, you know, whether they would use those results against what, you know, the system in its current state. And I hope someone does that.
Thank you very much.
But we didn't see any results from you, so we are talking 1 hour about the input and the sources and what are the results and how do you test the quality of the results. And isn't the language problem the biggest problem? Because as I get it, you're focused on English-speaking sources, and I think many more other sources are from different languages. It's not only a local problem or general problem, but it is a language problem. But I would like to hear something about your results. Is it really useful, or is it just more noise in the internet?
I mean, we did qualitative testing with journalists at the end, and we got some fairly good results. From that testing. I mean, I've subsequently done some further testing, comparing this tool with Geophedia and Spike and Twitter, using a sort of about 80 journalism students. And actually, what you find when you get them to use a set of tools and compare one against the other is that they sort of identify, quite quickly the sort of relative strengths and weaknesses of the tools, and then they start using them in combination. So they identify a trend using perhaps social sensor or Spike, and then they go into Geophedia and draw a circle around a particular geographical location, find the sources at the location, then maybe they go back into Twitter to find more about what that source has said over time. So, even though the ambition was to produce something that was kind of a one-stop shop, I don't think it was fully successful in doing that. But journalists and journalism students have found it useful as part of a range of tools that they use. So I'll be presenting again in Dubrovnik next week a bit more about how journalists use the tool in comparison with other similar tools.
And how about the language problem?
Yeah, I mean there's technically there's nothing to stop other languages being integrated. It's just a question of funding and time running out. And so